you so much for those brief reflections, but very insightful reflections, Dr. McCormick. We're going to pass things over now to Emily.
Thank you, Dr. McCormick, for sharing with us today. So now I'm going to try and share my screen and see if this will work. Hopefully it does. Does it look like it's working? Yep. There? Yep. Okay. So Atili, hi, hello everyone. My name is Emily Winters. I am Inuk on my father's side with familial ties to communities in the Nunatsiavut land region, including Makovik and Hopedale. And on my mother's side, I am settler European, and I was raised in the urban setting of St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador. Today, I am here to speak on behalf of the Psychology Graduate Students Association at the University of Regina and members of the Anti-Racism Speaker Series Planning Committee to discuss the Anti-Racism Speaker Series. And I'll talk a little bit about the relevance that this anti-racist work has to the mental health field as well. So first, I'd like to spend a bit of time talking about our motivation, and I think this explains a little bit of the relevance to the mental health field as well. So our main motivation with this speaker series was to amplify voices and provide changeable support to marginalized, particularly racialized individuals. We also wanted to supplement our graduate training as well. As psychology graduate students, we have noticed that there is limited coursework across the board, definitely not just at the U of R, across the board, across Canada. There's limited coursework on anti-racism. It's not included a whole lot in our training, so that's something that we wanted to address. And we also felt that it was important to make this type of learning opportunity accessible to others, not just people who are in an academic setting, but we wanted to provide a space for others to listen and learn how to be anti-racist allies in both their professional and personal lives. And finally, as future clinicians and experimental psychologists, we have an ethical obligation to support and participate in decolonial and anti-oppressive work. So I'm going to provide a bit of background on that now from a specific perspective, but I think it applies more broadly as well. So one thing that I wanted to discuss is how the CPA, the Canadian Psychological Association, created a task force responding to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's final report, which Dr. McCormick just mentioned, those 94 calls to action that came from that report. So the CPA responded to this report through a task force, and I can put the link to that report as well in the chat. If folks don't have access to it, it's at the bottom of the slides as well. So if the slides are shared, then you can access it that way. But I guess for a bit of background, the CPA Code of Ethics for psychologists, we have 4 main principles that we are to abide by as psychologists. And these are referenced in the task force's report.
Holy.
These 4 principles are respect for the rights and dignity of persons and people, responsible caring, integrity in relationships, and responsibilities to society. So in their report, the task force's response to the report, rather, they reference these principles and explain how the profession of psychology has contravened its own code of ethics in its treatment of Indigenous peoples in Canada. The task force included, among many recommendations, Dr. McCormick referenced, there's a plethora of recommendations out there, but they included some more recommendations specific to psychology, indicating that psychologists should advocate on behalf of Indigenous peoples and pursue social justice to ensure Indigenous peoples enjoy the same rights and living conditions as all Canadians. So I thought that recommendation really spoke to the type of work that we are trying to do with this series, in that we want to make sure that we are advocating for the rights and living conditions of marginalized individuals, particularly racialized individuals. And we want to create a space where people can become better allies. So I wanted to talk as well about CPA's definition of what an ally means. So again, this is specific to Indigenous peoples in Canada, but I do believe that it would apply more broadly as well. So they indicate that in terms of a definition of allyship and what that means, psychologists are called upon to openly identify themselves as allies and stand as advocates for those who have been oppressed by colonial systems. It is insufficient to have awareness and sympathies for the plight of Indigenous peoples in Canada. Members of this profession are called upon to work with and for Indigenous peoples. This will involve prioritizing the use of time to learn about and understand how Indigenous people conceptualize themselves and their families, communities, health, and the impacts of colonial systems on their histories and current lives. So I'll move on now to talk a little bit about our events specifically, what they have looked like, and provide a little bit of background on them. But I thought it was nice to start out with a bit of a understanding of why we wanted to do this work and the relevance that it really has to the mental health field. So far we have had 4 events, and we are in the process of planning a 5th. So we started with a session focused on systemic racism and mental health. Then we had a session on systemic racism in research and academia. That was followed up by a session on systemic racism in our community, meaning Regina or more broadly to Saskatchewan as well. And then we had a special topic session on decolonizing evidence-based medicine. So all of our sessions, with the exception of the 4th one so far, have been a panel style session with 3 speakers and a moderator. So I'll discuss a little bit more in depth what those sessions have looked like. So as I said, the first session was on systemic racism and mental health. We were very honored to have these 3 wonderful speakers come and present at this session. So the first speaker was Rachaela Davis, who has her master's in education. She's a psychotherapist and anti-oppression consultant and social justice advocate. Rachaela spoke about what it means to be an anti-racist psychotherapist, assessing for racial trauma and unpacking symptoms of racism. Next, we had Asante Houghton, who is an advocate for social awareness, justice, and community betterment, and above all, hope, which I really like. Asante discussed impacts of systemic racism on mental health and personal, familial, historical origins of distrust Black folks have of institutions. And then we had Tanya Churton, who has her Bachelor of Social Work. She's an educator, mental health advocate, storyteller. She discussed narratives taught about Black folks and their impacts in addition to collective care. So I wanted to discuss a little bit, about or kind of explain what these speakers focused on, because this session was focused on mental health. In describing the rest of the sessions, I'll just kind of mention who the speakers were and go through it that way. So the next session that we did was focused on systemic racism in research and academia. As graduate students, we felt that this was an important topic to cover as well. And I won't read everyone's bios here, all the speakers for the sake of time, but if the slides are sent out, again, feel free to read those. So for this session, we had Dr. Verna St. Dennis, who is an anti-racist education researcher and member of Beardy's and Okamasas First Nation. We had Anthony Elsom speak as well, who has his Bachelor of Arts honors in psychology. And he is the research coordinator for the Depression, Cognition, and Culture Lab at the University of Regina. We also had Dr. Carrie Barassa, who is the scientific director of the CIHR Institute for Indigenous Peoples Health and a professor at the University of Saskatchewan. So we were very honored, again, to have these 3 wonderful speakers come and present for our audience. And it was, again, a very meaningful session. We also had a session on racism in our community. Someone here is a little familiar. I'll get to hear from her in a moment. So for this session, we had Juliette Bouchy, who's an anti-racism and health educator and a doctoral student in the Faculty of Education at the University of Regina. We had Dr. Oba come and speak, who is an assistant professor at Ryerson University, former professor of social work at the University of Regina. And I won't speak too much about Latoya Reed because she's here today, luckily, so we'll get to hear more from her in a moment. But Latoya is a registered social worker actively advocating for social change, previously in the province of Saskatchewan, but now learning in Toronto, which is wonderful. So again, this was a very meaningful session, and I'm very grateful that I will again get to hear from Latoya, and that I'm able to share that with all of you here today. The last session that we had was a special topic session with one speaker, Dr. Jared Swidrovich, and he spoke about decolonizing evidence-based medicine. Dr. Swidrovich has been a pharmacist for the past 11 years, and he was the first self-identified First Nations doctor of pharmacy in Canada. And he's a current PhD candidate in education at the University of Saskatchewan. So those are what our events have looked like thus far. I think that they've all been really meaningful, all been very well attended, which is really nice to see. And yeah, so that's kind of a description of our events so far. I wanted to mention as well the funding success that we've had. So so far through those sessions that we've had and the work we've continued to do, we've raised over $7,000 to support our events. And a large chunk of that money has actually not been spent yet. It's dedicated to sessions that are in the works or going to happen later on in the year. But this funding goes almost exclusively, pretty much exclusively to fund our speakers or pay our speakers. So we pay all of our speakers an honorarium. And it's very important to us that these people are compensated for the emotional and mental labor and for sharing their knowledge with us and with community as well. So we have had funding from the Canadian Psychological Association, the clinical section specifically, the Regina Public Interest Research Group, MCOS, SaskTel, Sask Energy, Rising Youth, the U of R Graduate Student Association, as well as the Department of Psychology at the University of Regina as well. So the last thing that I really want to mention is I would be remiss not to mention the other members of the planning committee, because I certainly don't do any of this work alone. This work has been led by and initiated by a number of members of the PGSA at the University of Regina. So Rachel Krakauer, Hillary Power, Rebecca Corpus, Hannah Anstey, Kaylee DeLucre, and Ashley Balsam have put in a lot of work to these events. So I wanted to make sure that their work was acknowledged here. We are also very thankful to have two faculty members on our team, Dr. Natasha Gallant and Dr. Richard McLennan, who are very dedicated allies and give up their very limited time to help us organize and facilitate these events. So thank you, Nakamik, to them as well. So the last slide that I have is just saying thank you, Nakamik, for everyone for listening today. And I wanted to provide more information on where you can learn more about the speaker series. If you have suggestions, anyone in the audience on potential speakers, and potential topics as well for the series, specific focus areas that you think would be relevant, we'd love to hear more about it. You can reach us at urpsych@gmail.com, or on Facebook. If you look up Psych Grads Anti-Racism Speaker Series, which is a bit of a mouthful, but if you look it up, you'll find us. And we're also on Instagram. We have a Google form as well, where you can be added to a mailing list, and then you can be sent information on future events, as well as after each event, we send out actionable items that are created by the speakers, and that's where you can get access to that information. So I can put that link in the chat if that's okay with the organizers, and anyone who would like to hear more can do it that way. So again, thank you, Nakamik, for listening today, and I'll turn it over to our next speaker.